are we self-aware enough to separate our theology and our ideology? Because too often it's so conflated that we actually start to think that our political points are actually biblical points. And a lot of our biblical points or the political points may actually be in conflict with some of what Scripture actually calls us to do.
You're listening to the High Purpose Leadership Podcast with Dr. Mike McCormick. On this episode, he'll be talking with Dr. Arthur Satterwhite, who is currently the Vice President of Diversity, Belonging, and Strategy at Young Life and an adjunct professor at Regent University.
All right. Hey, we are back here for our second part of the conversation with Dr. Arthur Satterwhite. Arthur, thanks so much for what you're sharing with us and just helping us to wrap our minds around this idea of diversity, equity, inclusion, and really what you believe is the heart, as do I, is the issue of belonging. And what I want to do for this episode today is to talk a little bit more about how faith informs your view of this topic. And I want to do this. Not every episode will be specifically faith-based, and not all of our listeners will be faith-based. But I do feel like this particular topic, it's important for us to really get some education in this area and really start to think about how we think about the connection between our faith, in particular for those who were followers of Jesus, and what he taught, who he was and is, his church, the way that he set things up to operate. So particular for ministry leaders or faith-based leaders, people who have this component in their leadership and want to not have it disconnected from their life or leadership, but actually be an integrated leader. So for that reason, I just want to kind of carve out this episode for the connection between faith-based and the topic of diversity, in particular belonging. So for our faith-based friends, or maybe for those who want to learn a little bit about what Jesus might have to say about this, why should people of faith in particular be leading the way in diversity? Why should we be leading the way in this area?
And the simple answer is what Jesus did. If you look at Jesus's life, if you look at his purpose, if you look at everything that he embodied and then invited us as his followers to do and continue to perpetuate throughout the world, to the ends of the earth, it was belonging. If you recall, just thinking about the full gospel narrative, I'm talking about everything from creation to restoration at the end, with the fall and redemption in the middle, right? When Christ, God, the triune God, first created this earth, he created a garden, a space that was incredibly diverse and intentional, but we lost our access at the fall. We belonged in the first hand. He actually invited, humans through Adam and through Eve to take dominion, not dominate, but to take dominion and to be those who perpetuate that diversity, to cultivate it, to steward it. But when in the fall we lost access, we no longer belonged, not just to the garden, but to his kingdom, right? And when you look at the story of the Israelites and carving out a people unto himself to call the world back to himself, Jesus was the ultimate culminating climactic point in this narrative of what it looked like for a God, the God, to go to the extremes to create belonging for those who no longer belong to his kingdom. His death and resurrection wasn't just to save us and ensure that we could once again go to heaven. It was so that we would actually belong to his kingdom, that we could be those heirs, his brothers and sisters, royal chosen priesthood once again. So when I see in Jesus and what he did for those disciples, those ragamuffin, rabble-rouser, outcasts, that group of folks they called himself, he said, hey, you don't belong here, but through me, through your belief in me, you confessing me as Lord, and you accepting my sacrifice for you on this cross, I'm giving you an invitation. I'm handing you a citizenship to once again belong in this kingdom that you wouldn't belong in otherwise. And I think that, again, when he calls us to follow him, in that invitation is to be those who perpetuate that, who invite others to belong into the kingdom, help not just tell them about them and teach them about it, but we actually model for them, show them, invite them, welcome them into the kingdom so that they belong to.
Man, I was thinking about actually Jesus, what he did when he walked this earth, and he picked 12 disciples. They were so different. You're thinking about diversity. I mean, he's got political spectrum. He's got a zealot who's ready to take over, Rome, by military force. He's got a tax collector who's out there collecting money for Rome. Like they couldn't have been diverse political. He's
outcast.
Outcast, right? He's got social status. He's got fishermen who, business guys, but ragamuffin guys, versus more educated. He's and then just thinking even past the 12, the women are following with him all along the way. They are at cross, they are at tomb. Yeah, right. Yeah, that's right. Even people, from a moral perspective, who would have been outcast. The Samaritan woman, great picture there. A Samaritan, cultural difference, woman, gender difference, married 5 times, and then living with her 5th or 6th one. She would not have fit in the temple at that day. She would have been an outsider, and yet Jesus has this personal interaction with her, and I love that because people's past or their social differences never stop Jesus from having that personal encounter with him and inviting them to become, to belong and to become with him, right? That was an open invitation. I love that part. Yeah.
Amen. And I think it's for that reason that as Christians, we should be leading the way in this conversation. Contrary to, I think, what has become the cultural, caricature, that, Christians are against it. It's like, no, we should be the ones leading the way, creating the culture for it. There is such a gospel, not even just a gospel, but a biblical imperative for diversity, equity, inclusion, and yes, belonging. When we look at Revelation 7, right, that every nation, tribe, and tongue is there worshiping the throne. He didn't say one people came together. He said every nation, tribe, and tongue and people. Like, he celebrated the diversity in that, and that mirrored the diversity created in Genesis, right? But then there's that equity when exactly. We look at Acts 2, and my picture of equity, and I look at Acts 2 in that church there at the end of the chapter, nobody went without. They sold everything they had. They realized that certain people came to the table with more and with less, but this is about how do we ensure that we can all thrive together as brothers and sisters, as hands and feet, as people who are part of the same body of Christ. But then I look at Acts 6, for inclusion, right? There's that point of tension, and the Hellenistic Jews, they weren't getting their food. They weren't included in what was the system and the process of the day. And instead of being like, well, sorry, I'm gonna get mine, so you best get yours. They said, wait a second, pause, time out. We gotta create a new system. We gotta appoint some new people because we have to make sure that they are brothers and sisters with us, so they should be part of this too. There is clear biblical mandate for this work that isn't political. It's not ideological. It is us just being like the Good Samaritan, following, modeling, and living and loving as Christ loved.
Yeah, I really do think this is for our faith-based friends who are listening, this is actually a really big blind spot for us, is that generally speaking, we tend to see the world through our limited perspective, which also has to do with our cultural lens, our background, and not just related to things like race and gender, but also just like the times that we live, the moment in history. And so because of the political lines that are drawn right now on this particular topic, you tend to see, politics, or without even thinking about it, most Christians will sort of default to whatever their sort of political persuasion is, and they kind of construct a view of this topic based on that. And what I want to say on this topic is, let's set that aside for a minute and let's actually go back, because the first century was a totally different time in history. And let's look at what Jesus said. Let's look at what the church was a picture of. I loved all your examples in Acts 6. The people they appointed were people whose names reflected the Hellenistic culture, the Greek culture. So the majority culture was Jewish. They were in Jerusalem. The minority culture at that point would have been those who were outside of the Jewish faith, so the Hellenists, the Greeks. And so they're getting overlooked. I don't think the 12 apostles were like, hey, let's marginalize those widows over there. No, they weren't. It was just a blind spot. We're just taking care of their people who was in front of them. But there was a group of people who weren't at the table earlier. Actually, that's what they do. So and the table in this case was where money was received and given out. So they were being left out of the table.
Yeah.
And they appoint people, leaders who reflect the minority culture so that they're at the table, literally at the table, dispensing the resources, equity, so that the whole body is taken care of, right? It's an awesome picture. And then I think, man, how different was in that time for you to go and be part of a community that, became known as the church because you're a Jesus follower, and you could be slave, I could be free, you could be rich, I could be poor, you could be male, I could be female, and we're all in a house together.
Mm-hmm.
That did not happen. That was no way that was happening anywhere outside. So the church was leading the way. Followers of Jesus and the gospel was leading the way in diversity.
Yeah.
I think what as believers or followers of Jesus in 2022, we need to kind of get outside of our current framework and remember who Jesus was, the church was, and recapture some of that. That would do us all.
Yeah. Oh, 100%. I think this is where I come back to. I mean, I know we talked about it in the last podcast, right? The importance of emotional intelligence. Are we self-aware enough to separate our theology and our ideology? Because too often it's so conflated that we actually start to think that our political points are actually biblical points. And a lot of our biblical points or the political points may actually be in conflict with some of what scripture actually calls us to do. I mean, how often are we actually going to the homeless and serving them? How often are we actually intentionally welcoming in the orphan and the outcast and those who are not just the least and the last and the lost, but the left out too? Because again, that's what we see Jesus doing. Not, that's because a political agenda is saying, trying to shame us into doing or cancel us because we're not doing, but because we see that the Bible offers us a better way. And that better way isn't about elevating ourselves. It's about elevating those who would be downcast or oppressed or set aside otherwise. That is the essence of our faith and the head of our faith. And that we're invited to model as we seek to grow and become more like Jesus as we mature as Christians too.
Yeah. Oh man. Well said. It's a question of, if I had to choose between the way I currently think or the way that the people I hang around with currently think, or the way that Jesus thinks, the way that Jesus sees people, if I have to choose between those, which one am I going to choose? And I think that that's something we all need to sort of reckon with and do our own little gut check on that. No one can answer that for any of us individually, but I've certainly been challenged in that way. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is just put myself in circumstances and around people who are different than myself, who think different, who look different, who are a different, social status, all those kinds, just different. And I'm curious from your perspective. I want to shift gears a little bit toward somewhat of solution or picture of what good looks like. Maybe we say it like that. We have the model of Jesus in the early church, but like in today's ministry world, you do a lot in ministry. So what does diversity in a sense of belonging, what does that look like and sound like in ministry? Like what are you seeing in ministry context? Like that's it needs to be more like that,
Yeah. No, that's good. I gotta shout him out. Bishop Cole Alexander is someone who I've looked up to, who leads and models this for a lot of us. And he actually came and spoke with my organization a few months back, and he put it this way: we have to move away from ministry models of ministry being 2 or 4, and move toward models of ministry that is ministry with. Let me give you an example. If you're seeing if your vantage point, your perspective of ministry is, I'm doing this for them, whoever them is, or I'm going to bring this to them, those people, whatever they are, whatever their background, whatever it is, whoever them is, if you're doing ministry to or for them, then that's not, you're not doing it with. They're still other. They're not part of. They don't belong. They're not really your brothers and sisters. They're at best maybe neighbors. That you occasionally bring, a fruitcake to every now and again because you want to feel good about yourself. When you move to ministry with, and shout out to Johnny and Friends and A Young Life or Capernaum Ministry, because I think they're maybe offering one of the best examples of this. The ministry with looks like
special needs.
Yeah, sorry. It looks like when you're serving families or kids or people with disabilities or special needs, are you doing it to them? Or are you doing it for them? Do you see them as less than or different from, or do you see them as your brother or your sister? Equally gifted, equally talented, equally filled with purpose and creative intent by our God, such that they have something to bring to our communities, to our teams, to our outreaches, to our ministry, so that we're doing it with them, not for them, not to them. We don't see them as less than, but we see them as partners in. That's when you start to move from a ministry to or a ministry for to a ministry with. And if you just, scale that out across cultural backgrounds, I have a whole soapbox about short-term missions, so I won't go there today. But again, are we doing stuff with people, or are we doing stuff to or for because we see unconsciously some level of hierarchy, superiority even, and we're doing it more out of pity, even though we may not call it that. But it's really, in that sense, not about them. It's about us, knowing that we checked off that box. And in that sense, Mike, we're not very far off from the Pharisees.
Oh, ouch. Hey, wait now. You're stepping on toes now. Come on. So
I see it.
I'm thinking that there's a progression, right? There's a leader or a leadership team who just thinks about themselves. They're not even aware of other people. That's kind of major block button number one. Then there's someone who's like, oh, I can see a little bit further. I probably ought to think about other people and not just myself. So let me go help them, those people. Let me go serve, right? And certainly Jesus calls us to serve the least, last, lost, left behind. I love that.
Yep.
So that's a step in the right direction. But I think what you're talking about when it comes to belonging, when it comes to really Christ-like ministry, is to do it with. And Jesus, again, he does his ministry with he calls them to preach and to be with him. Actually, gospel says with him, right? When they start the church, it's the 12 who are leading together. When they're going to start mission work, Paul gets called. It's Paul and Barnabas, or Paul and there's always it's never a person or one person going to those people. There's always ministry with and alongside. And personally, I really feel like this shift in leadership from a solo person or leader to mutual leadership, shared leadership, leadership teams or co-leaders is a wonderful first step in this, because you're going to partner with somebody and pick someone who's different than you, right? Common vision, purpose, mission, but looks, sounds, different personality, different gender. It could be all kind of differences, but pick somebody who's different. Yeah. Then the world can see, man, look, this is what it looks like. I got one last thing that I'm going to stop. I was talking to someone in your organization who worked with Capernaum, with children with disabilities. And she said, when I got into that ministry to help people, ended up, I'm the one that got help. She said that she was in a specific situation where she was going on a walk with a young lady. I think it was a camp with a young lady who had disabilities, and she was so slow. And the lady was like, come on, am I ever going to get around this lake? And she was very impatient. And the girl wanted to hold her hand, and she felt like she was kind of holding her back a little bit. And then about halfway through, she said God just broke her and realized that, no, she needed to adjust her pace so they could go together. And she called this, she said, she used this quote on social media a little bit ago. She said that girl, that experience was a speed bump for my soul. She said it slowed me and allowed me to connect in a more meaningful way. And she said, and I learned so much.
Yeah.
I needed that. I was addicted to pace and achievement and production. And she said, God did some work in my life when I synced up with someone else who was different. I was like, man, that's it. That's it. And I think that's the gospel, that God bridges. Yeah. He's a reconciler and he wants us to move together. So I love your idea of practically eating, belonging by doing ministry with people, not just to them or for them. So, all right, I got one question. We need to wrap. I could talk forever with you about this stuff.
Same here, my friend.
For people who are, it's just kind of like, man, tidal wave. It's just coming at me. They're feeling a little bit overwhelmed, right? Like, yes, I hear it, I believe it, but man, I don't even know where to start. What would you say is a good place to start? Where would you recommend people start if in their faith journey they want to move the needle in diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging?
I mean, I'll bring it right back to kind of where we started this whole conversation, Mike. Start at your table, your dining room table, your living room table, whatever table you have, your picnic table. Start at your table. Start with a meal. Who's around your table? Who's in your friend circle? Who do you have deep relationship with? Do they all look like you? Come from a similar background as you? Have the same, political, ideological, whatever perspective as you? Are they diverse? Do they bring diversity? Do they challenge you? Do they offer something that you've never seen, experienced, or heard before? Start at your table and start by intentionally going out and trying to find who is not there and build relationship with them. And I'll take it even a step further, Mike. It's not even just about like, hey, can I invite somebody different over to my house, to my table? Won't you go to their house and go to their table? Make yourself subservient or less than, or available. It's just available to be there and be open to them. And yes, it may be uncomfortable because it's new, it's different, it's maybe unfelt or unseen or unexperienced before you. But I promise you, in almost every situation, just like that story you just told about my colleague walking around the lake with her young friend, you will be better for it.
Yeah, buddy.
You will learn from it. You will experience something. Your walls will be expanded. Your perspective will be added to. And if you really want to get crazy with them, Mike, invite them over and give them your kitchen. Have them cook for you. So again, it's not just you being the one in power and in control, but you saying, "Hey, this is only good because we're both in it and we're both doing it together with and alongside one another." That, to me, it's a small step. I mean, it's not an easy step, but it's still a small step. There's a lot of other things that you could do that are bigger, much more intensive, require much more than you giving up a few hours of your time on a Wednesday or Thursday night.
Yeah,
that's a good place to start.
That's a good word, man. That's a good word. Well, hey, man, I look forward to getting around the table with you sometime in the near future. We've shared some good meals, and I'm looking forward to our next one. Thanks so much, man, for being on the show. We really appreciate it.
Appreciate you, brother. Thanks for all you're doing, and thanks for creating a space like this so that others in our community can learn too.
All right. Talk to you soon.
Now we want to land the conversation, the part of the podcast where we prepare you to put this into practice. Hey, we just heard from Dr. Arthur Satterwhite on faith and diversity. This is part 2 of the interview. So if you missed part 1, I encourage you to go back, listen to diversity, equity, and inclusion. It was very powerful. But we're going to jump right in. Mike, you and Dr. Arthur talked about the importance of belonging and how Jesus modeled that for us by gathering this diverse spectrum of disciples. I think sometimes we can read the Bible and forget that the Bible is not all inclusive of all the happenings that happened, right? When they walked with Jesus. So we kind of miss the nitty gritty, the details of arguments or disagreements, but we get a little bit of glimpses here and there, like when the disciples were arguing about who is the greatest, or even Paul and Barnabas. So I I have this question when we talk about faith and diversity. As a leader, we see kind of a little bit of conflict in the Bible amongst the disciples, but as
Yeah.
disciples of Christ, how can we walk through conflict well when we're being encouraged to come together with all these different people, all these different experiences, perspectives, and we haven't been a nation that has known how to conflict well. How do we walk through that well? What are some words that we can say when we offend others or when we get offended?
Oh yeah. Well, first, great point. Just expect it, right? It's going to come. Certainly happened with Jesus' own disciples, and you do see it in the early church a lot. So don't expect that you're going to get through this life and leadership in particular without any conflict. So yeah, expect that it's going to come. But Jesus gives us some really helpful parameters in on how to handle that. And the main dominant image that's in my mind is this idea of a peacemaker, a peacemaker. And in the Beatitudes, Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." That there's something at the heart of who God is, that He is a reconciler, He is a
Mm,
bridge builder. I really like that picture of a bridge builder. That there's something about bringing people together who are in conflict or in enmity, that God has a way of restoring that. And so, I think there are two extremes when you think about peacemaking. Some people are actually peace fakers. Peace fakers. They think, "Oh, I'll just stuff it. I'll just hide it. I'll just keep taking it. How are you doing? I'm fine. No worries." So some people are just peace fakers. They really are bothered, but they're really not telling the truth, right? So Jesus says that's not the way. You can't be a peace faker. And then some people are peace breakers or peace takers. Like they are on the offensive all the time. They're brash. They don't respect people's personal boundaries or opinions, so they're the aggressors in those situations. And Jesus says, that's not the way to be either, mutual respect. So you don't want to be a peace faker. You don't want to be a peace taker or breaker. He says, be a peace maker. And that doesn't just happen. You actually have to make some intentional choices to bring people together. And I think a lot of our responsibility as leaders these days is to help people navigate through conflict and to resolve that well. So a couple things I like to think about. Jesus talks about taking the plank out of your own eye so that you can see to take the speck out of another. So when there's a hurt or an offense, to first do a personal inventory of yourself, basically asking yourself, what is my part in this? And guess what? There's always some part you play. It always takes two in conflict. And we're always, we think we see the other person's real clear. But Jesus' point is, well, you might want to dislodge your own part first. So taking a little personal inventory in prayer and saying, God, what part of this do I own? I don't own everything. The whole thing's not my fault, but what is my part? And when you go into a conversation, being willing to admit that and own that, and be able to say, hey, this is something I know is not right, and I want to apologize for that. So coming in with owning your part really helps. And then generally, I think what happens is in these conflicts, you observe different behaviors. In fact, the book Crucial Conversations points this out, that there's these events that happen, and you observe them, and then in between the events, you kind of fill in the gap by telling yourself a story of what that person did and why they did it. And sometimes that story is not true. Sometimes it's in your head, the way you've connected the dots. It's not reality, but you are actually offended by something of the story you've made up. So some words that I've started to use are, hey, I was wondering if we could get together and talk about this. First, that's actually helpful in itself, a face-to-face conversation. So many days, conflicts right now we're trying to solve through texting with our thumbs or social media post or a message. Get face-to-face. Gosh, that's just like point number one. But then own your part, right? And say, hey, first, I want to admit my part. But secondly, from my perspective, here's what I observed you. Now, help me understand, what did you really mean? What was really going on? So you're already admitting that you just see things from a perspective. The story you have in your mind may or may not be true, but you're going to withhold really being confirmed in that opinion until you have the respectful conversation with someone to listen first. So that's what I think. Be a peacemaker, be a bridge builder. How do you do that? You own your part first. You have a real conversation. And when it comes to their part of the situation, you tell them what you've seen, what you've observed, and then ask them to help fill in the gaps and help me understand. Then you have the kind of building blocks to start, your part, their part, and you start to kind of meet in the middle for building that bridge.
So good. And it's such helpful tools and practical because a lot of times we enter into conflict already on the defense. And what happens is the words that we bring into conflict is a lot of you words, right? Hey, so when you did this
Yeah.
and you did this, this is how you made me feel. And
Right.
we center conversation around that, and that already, I mean, the conflict is already tense. And so when you come at it from a place of attack or a place of
Mm,
defensiveness, there's not much that can get done. There's already a divide of you and me versus let's figure this out together. And so I think that's really practical. Come and own your part.
yeah.
Um, say about your own perspective.
Yes.
And the narrative that we create can become so powerful in our minds. And we do have to be careful because we carry those narratives wherever we go. However, we fill our stories, whether it's, whether we gotten hurt before. And so we carry that narrative into a new conflict,
Yeah.
and so we carry a lot of backstory into new circumstances.
Well, and this is what makes it especially difficult with our topic today, as far as diversity and everything around that, because by definition, what you're saying is you're bringing more differences from experience and backgrounds into the working together. So there are reasons why people don't want to create diverse teams, because there is a lot of conflict. There are a lot of different perspectives. So being able to handle conflict, expect it, and being able to put it on the table has to become part of a team that's going to be high performing. If you're going to have that, the different generations, genders, cultural backgrounds, all of those things are things that we bring that become sort of blind spots. They're just the lens we see the world through, and being willing to admit, hey,
Yeah.
I have a perspective, but I don't really see the world completely as it is. I see it through my perspective. So help me understand how you see it as well. And I think that just that posture of humility and even curiosity, like, hey, help me understand. How do you see it? That approach is so much better than defensiveness and digging your heels in and going to fight over it.
Yeah, I think the posture of curiosity is so key too, because it shows people that you are willing to learn and
Yes.
listen, and that there's something that I can give. I mean, that's powerful, when I am in a place, in a position where someone is telling me, or it feels like, "Oh, I have something that you can learn from me." That's amazing. That helps me belong. That
Yes.
helps me belong.
Yeah,
Yeah.
well, it gives you a space to step in, and your voice is now able to be heard. And you have to be genuine. You can't just say it and not mean it. Like, people can tell if you're just saying it. But I think if you come into that, so there is some personal prep before you go into that conversation to say, am I in the right space? Is my head in the right place? Is my heart in the right place? And if it's not, do the hard work on your own before you get in there, with the Lord, and ask for His help. But you want to get to that place where you are genuinely open and inquisitive, curious, and
Yes.
willing to admit, hey, I see things a certain way, but I may not see it completely. Help me understand.
Yeah. Yeah, that's so good. And I don't know if this is just kind of off topic, but it reminds me of when we talk about the posture of our heart, humility, and that curiosity. I have had people ask me, "So where are you from?" And I, again, if you're a first-time listener, I am Chinese American and I look 100% Chinese. And so I have a lot of people ask me, "So where are you from?" And let me just tell you the difference between the posture of curiosity versus any other posture of heart. I've had people ask me that, and when I tell them I'm Chinese, they're like, "Oh man, when I was in China," and they would go on for about 10 minutes about how they've had experience in China and all this stuff, which granted could very well be their way of trying to connect with me. But I've also had people say, "Where are you from?" And then I would say, "Oh, I'm Chinese, but my family is from Taiwan." And then they would ask me questions about myself and
Mm.
ask me about my story and how I came here and genuinely curious to know who I am. And I think that that's just even a small distinction of someone who they may ask the same questions, but again, having to be careful of my own narrative that I bring in. I could be defensive right away. Like, here we go, another person who, but really it's that, man, that genuineness of wanting to know who I am versus what they want to know or what they already know possibly about me. So,
Yeah, that's so good. That's a great example, and I do think that gets it, which is what we're trying to do with these episodes on diversity in general, is to get to the heart of the issue of belonging, which really is about, do people know me, care about me, value me? And so that's a great example. So am I just asking you a question because I'm curious, but then I just want to tell you everything about me,
yeah,
or
yeah,
do I really want to get to know you? And I
yeah,
think that posture of a genuine connection and interest in your life, and
yeah,
then you would reciprocate at the right time. But yeah, not just teeing up a conversation so I can tell you everything I think,
right.
but actually caring.
Yeah, yeah. I think when we talk about faith and diversity, sometimes this topic is really difficult to walk through within our Christian community. We kind of have these two extremes. One would be diving in 100% into DEI work, really without, moral boundaries or parameters or sort of any sort of standards. But then we also have the other extreme that would completely dismiss it and say, I'm not going to take a step forward unless you conform to my standards.
Yeah.
Um, Give a little bit of what maybe a middle ground. It's not perfect, right? It's not going to be perfect, but maybe what a middle ground could possibly look like.
Yeah, I think the idea of building a bridge is a good one. I'm noticing my picture in the background. I've got a bridge there. I think the idea of admitting right now as a believer that we live in a very polarized society, and that our perspective, our experience, our political backgrounds, all of those things contribute to where we kind of land on these different topics. And just to admit that, hey, the gospel transcends our cultural preferences, and that has always been the case. I think about Jesus, when he walked this earth 2,000 years ago over in Palestine. The Jew Samaritan conflict there was tremendous enmity between those two groups. And Jewish people back then didn't talk to Samaritans. In fact, they would avoid that region. They would literally go around it. And when Jesus tells the story about what it means to have eternal life and the greatest commandments, he tells the story of the good Samaritan who becomes the hero of the story. No one at that time would have expected a Samaritan to be the example of what good looks like for loving your neighbor. And then when Jesus goes to the woman at the well, she's a Samaritan woman, and again, people would have never even gone into that area, let alone talk to a Samaritan woman. So Jesus crosses all of these
Yeah.
cultural boundaries. But why does he do that? He does it because he's on mission. That he's there to reach everyone. Everyone is worthy of an encounter with him, and that's why he came. And so I think, middle ground just means I need to be willing to admit that wherever I land, my perspective on life, that the gospel is bigger than that. And
Mm,
I need to be able to hold up what I think is true or the way I see the world, and hold it up against what Jesus says, what he calls us to, and this idea of bringing the gospel to everyone. And that really is our mission as Christians. So when that mission becomes first and foremost, there's going to be some things for all of us in our lives that are going to need to be adjusted or dialed up or dialed down in order to conform to what Jesus is really all about. So I think that's a better middle ground to say, hey, how can I take a step toward each other, be a bridge builder, and be about the gospel message, not just kind of locked into whatever my news feed tells me, or the channels on TV that I watch, whatever my natural sort of inputs are, which basically just confirm my own bias already.
yeah.
That God wants to, he's bigger than that. That the gospel doesn't fit in those boxes neatly. Yeah,
Yeah, that's so good. It's not just about, let's say, the letter of the law or the truth of the gospel, but it's also the spirit, the heart of the gospel, merging both of those things together.
for sure.
Yeah, that's good. Um, you guys had talked a little bit about, moving away from the to someone for someone ministry model
Yes, Arthur really
towards
brought
the
that up.
yeah towards the with them ministry model. What does that look like? Can you give me a couple of examples that could maybe paint a little bit better of that picture.
Yeah, let me just say that this particular area is an area that I have been learning and growing, in particular over the last 8 years. And so a couple things that I'm seeing God do in my life and leadership that's different than how I was operating before. So a couple examples. One is just a shift from a point person to a team model of leadership, and there's a lot of words in the Bible that talk about co-laboring, partnership in the gospel. All of those ideas are literally what co-labor is, where we get the word collaborate from. And partnership is that same idea. There's this together, this mutuality, and that's the dominant word that Paul uses for doing ministry. He always goes out, with someone. Jesus, when he sends people out, twos. So there's a biblical precedent for doing things together with a team of people. So I think that's probably step one. At our local church here in Kentucky, I was the lead pastor, and now we have four of us that are a team, and that team is different generations and different genders, and we're coming together. So in our world, we've kind of morphed to a more diverse view of leadership, and each one taking our part. So that would be step one, a change for me. But also, I think when it comes to sort of engaging with a local community or engaging across culture lines, one of the changes that I've made is just instead of, it's kind of started with me creating or leading or initiating initiatives out in our community and then wanting to include everyone in that. So inviting them into that space. But what I quickly realized was I was still in charge, I was still leading. And I was still kind of leading with a dominant culture way. And so what I've shifted to is to find ways where others who are in minority cultures are leading and to join them in those efforts so that, and sometimes I'm in the driver's seat, but in sometimes I move over to kind of the passenger seat and I find where they're leading and I become a support for them. So practically, in our community, we have a church that's traditionally in the downtown area and in a historically Black community, the church is. And so I, for about a year and a half, just went and served at that food pantry. That church is leading that mission. It's in a different part of town from where my church is. And I just went and spent time and, hey, whatever they needed help with, you guys let me know and I'll do it. So finding a way, we all have our own kind of comfort zones. And I think essentially being willing to get out of your leadership comfort zone and give someone the space and freedom and find where they're already leading and then join that. That's been a good process for me as far as leading with and not just to another group of people.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to this posture that you have, Mike, of the willingness to listen and to learn. And when you do that, it brings value to those that are already doing something, that are leading their group, and it helps kind of, like you were saying, kind of when you step out of the way or you step to the side, it helps create more space and for others to rise. And we don't, I think as leaders, we often forget that that we can be either bottlenecks or shadows or ceilings or whatever. And sometimes we just need to get out of the way and we
Yeah.
realize, man, like let me see what you're doing and let me be the shoulders you stand on. What can
Yeah.
I do to support you and in what you're doing?
This
Um,
kind of gets back in an indirect way, but that topic we were talking about where you can have an idea and try to get people to buy in, or you can kind of create things together or let other people have ownership. So this is a similar thing. I think people who have maybe been like me or in leadership in similar kind of environments, you're always used to being the initiator, the leader. And a lot of times what we get frustrated about, if we're honest, is why don't other people step up? Like, why am I still the one doing all this work? And particularly in a diversity conversation, you can say, well, why aren't other people stepping into this? I'm trying to get them to step in and include them, and they're not wanting to show up. But what I found was, well, you're still inviting them to your thing, basically. So,
yeah.
it hit me at some point, maybe I should stop doing my thing and inviting them into it and say, hey, what's your thing? Like, what do you care about? Like, what matters to you? And what help do you need? How could I support you in that? So I'm not just passive, I'm playing a part, but they're really leading in an area that they feel like God's called them to, or that matters to them, that they want to make a difference, and finding a way to get into that space. And for that time, be a support person for them. So that's been a really helpful discipline for me, is not always to have to be the one leading, organizing, which then I get frustrated when people aren't, but just to step back and say, hey, where is this already happening, and how can I join into somebody else's effort, and be a support there? So that might help someone out there today.
Yeah, that's so good. And as a leader, I remember there are times when, the same frustration, why aren't people stepping up? Or you've created the space, but, there's still a lack of leadership or initiative. And I've had to go back and ask myself, have I created a safe space for people to feel like they're able to rise? Just recognizing, just the risk it is when that's not the norm yet, and you're trying to change the culture, that, man, it's a risk for those to step up and say something for fear of rejection or backlash or whatever the previous culture might have been like. And then two, have I resourced them enough for them to feel like, man, if I input this, is there enough resources to even, will it even matter? Will it actually come to fruition? And so I think as a leader, some of those questions for ourselves as well, in that space.
So good.
Uh,
Yeah. So when they are stepping up, instead of saying, how can I lead or initiate, saying, how can I remove some barriers? How can I continue to
yeah.
create the safe space so they can keep going? So we do have a leadership role there to play, but it's maybe different than we're used to. And it's a lot more about supporting, and which is really serving leadership, coming back to our first episode. But in this cross-cultural scenario, I think being a barrier remover and creating some safety so that others can step in, and then getting behind that is a great first step in when you're wanting to shift that culture and make it a more diverse experience. Yeah.
Yeah, you and Dr. Arthur talked a little bit about going to other people's homes and being a part of their table. And new leadership is not easy. It's not easy. None of these things that we're talking about is like, oh man, it just feels so good to be, to be vulnerable and to open yourself up for feedback. And, none of that feels good. But I just think that this concept of going to someone else's house, I love hosting. I love it when people come to my house. And even in conversation with you, Dr. Mike, I realized it's because I love control.
Right. There's some
Right?
comfort there. Right.
There's
Right.
comfort. I can control my environment. It's my own kitchen. It's my own food. And so really there's just this place where being vulnerable and losing control, letting go of our need as leaders for control. Oh, that could be a whole topic right there.
You're on to it, and I think there's a lot more of that goes under in our minds and in our hearts than we are willing to realize. And so, just doing a little bit of a check on that,
Yeah.
and in some ways, you're trusting then, because we're talking and figure about faith-based stuff now, that God's the one who's in charge. He's the one in control. Here's what I honestly think, Janine. I honestly think that God is creating a space in our culture today for a new kind of leader, a leader who really cares about people first, and that the
Yeah.
mission is critical and the people are too. And you can't do one at the expense of the other. It's got to be a both and those things have to be in sync with each other to really keep going. And for those leaders who are so fast paced and so future driven that they're missing the moment, or they're missing the people, I think that those days are over, because no one's signing up to go to work for that anymore, and a lot of leaders are hurting right now. And actually next month, we're going to talk a lot more about that. So I think this is a great lead in for next month as well. Yeah.
Yeah, so September is National Recovery Month, and we have just a couple of amazing episodes coming up, conversations about the general need for mental health and a focus on that in our current world stage, especially coming out of a pandemic. We're kind of still in a pandemic, really, but kind of just, on it looks different now than it did before. And then just the workforce teams that have been caring for those
Yeah.
who have had to work through mental health, so their need for mental health. So we have just a couple of really good episodes coming up. We encourage you to tune in, and we really look forward to that conversation in September.
Looking forward to it.
Thanks for listening to the High Purpose Leadership Podcast. To work with Dr. Mike McCormick, head over to highpurposepractice.com.